trivia. First question we have: what did Joseph's brothers do to deceive their father to cover up that they had sold Joseph in slavery?
Dipped his coat into the blood of a goat. Genesis chapter 37 verse 31.
What kind of leaves did Adam and Eve sew together to make clothes for themselves?
Leaves of fig. Genesis chapter 3 verse 7.
What was the name of the tower that the people were building when God confused their language?
They were building Tower of Babel. Genesis chapter 11 verse 4 and 9.
Whose name means father of great multitude?
Abraham. Genesis chapter 17 verse 5.
Of what did Potiphar's wife falsely accuse Joseph, resulting in him being thrown into prison?
Rape. Genesis chapter 39 verse 12 to 20.
What was the name of Abraham's first wife?
Her name was Sarah. Genesis chapter 17 verse 15.
What did God do on seventh day after he had finished creating everything?
God rested. Genesis chapter 2 verse 1 to 3.
Whose father was prepared to sacrifice him on an altar?
Isaac. Genesis chapter 22 verse 9.
What was Esau doing while Jacob stole his blessing?
He was hunting. Genesis chapter 27 verse 1 to 3 and verse 23.
Why did Jacob initially send Joseph's brother into Egypt?
To buy corn. Genesis chapter 42 verse 2 and 3.
How many books are there in the Bible?
There are 66 books in the Bible. Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 to Revelation chapter 22 verse 21.
For what did Esau sell his birthright to Jacob?
For a meal. Genesis chapter 25 verse 30 to 34.
Who was the oldest person in the Bible?
He was Methuselah. Genesis chapter 5 verse 27.
How many years did Methuselah live?
He lived for 969 years. Genesis chapter 5 verse 27. Who built the ark?
Noah. You can read this in Genesis chapter 6 verse 11 to 22.
How many days and nights did it rain during the great flood?
40 days and 40 nights. You can read this in Genesis chapter 7 verse 12.
How many people were on the ark?
There were 8 people in the ark. You can read in Genesis chapter 7 verse 13 and 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 20.
After being afloat for 5 months, that is 150 days, what mountain did Noah's ark finally land on?
In Ararat. You can find the answer in Genesis chapter 8 verse 4.
What sign did God give Noah to show that never again would he flood the whole earth?
Rainbow. In Genesis chapter 9 verse 11 you can read about it.
What were the names of Noah's 3 sons?
Shem, Ham and Japheth. You can read in Genesis chapter 9 verse 18.
Who was a mighty warrior and a mighty hunter before the Lord?
Nimrod. You can read about Nimrod in Genesis chapter 10 verse 9.
Who was the king of Salem to whom Abraham gave a tenth of everything?
He is Melchizedek. You can read about him in Genesis chapter 14 verse 8.
To whom did God give the covenant of circumcision?
To Abraham. You can read about this in chapter 17 verse 9 and 10.
Whose wife turned into a pillar of salt?
Lot's wife turned into pillar. Genesis 19 verse 26.
Who had a dream of a staircase between heaven and earth that was being used by angels?
Jacob dreamed about the staircase between heaven and earth, and you can read about this in Genesis chapter 28 verse 12.
Who wrestled with God?
Jacob wrestled with God. You can read in chapter 32 of Genesis verse 25 to 28. Dear listeners, today we brought you Bible trivia from the book of Genesis, and now we'll go to a song.